The strangest thing about Pierce Sullivan's divorce wasn't that his wife took the house, the Lexus, the savings account, and nearly everything else. It was that he looked relieved when she did. At 43, Pierce worked maintenance at Alder Ridge Residences in Portland. Most people saw a man with grease under his fingernails, a 12-year-old Ford Ranger, and a paycheck too small to fight a luxury realtor in court. Madison Sullivan believed the same thing. What she didn't know was that Pierce had spent months organizing documents, dates, and signatures while everyone else was counting bedrooms, vehicles, and bank balances. The settlement agreement slid across the polished conference table. Madison reached for the final page. Pierce picked up his pen, and the moment he signed, Abigail Mercer quietly closed a folder that Madison should have been far more worried about. If you're watching from somewhere in the world, today drop your country and local time in the comments. It's always interesting to see where these stories are reaching people. And if you enjoy slow burn stories where patience beats panic and facts matter more than appearances, consider subscribing. Tomorrow's story might hit even closer to home. 9 years earlier, before lawyers' settlement agreements and carefully organized evidence folders entered his life, Pierce Sullivan had met Madison Reed in a crowded coffee shop near Portland State University. At the time, neither of them looked like the person they would eventually become. Pierce was 34. Madison was 30. She worked as a junior real estate agent trying to build a client list. He supervised maintenance crews for a mid-sized apartment management company. Their first conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Madison talked quickly. Pierce listened. That pattern would continue for years. Back then, Madison liked that about him. She liked the fact that he wasn't trying to impress anyone. She liked that he remembered small details, the way she took her coffee, the names of her parents, the date of her licensing exam. When she passed that exam, Pierce drove across Portland during rush hour traffic, with flowers sitting on the passenger seat of his truck. No social media post, no grand gesture, just flowers and dinner. She cried that night. For a while, life felt simple. They married 18 months later. Their first apartment was a one-bedroom place near Selwood. The dishwasher barely worked. The bathroom sink leaked whenever temperatures dropped below freezing. Neither of them cared. Madison's business slowly grew. Pierce continued working long hours. Every promotion he earned came from reliability rather than ambition. When pipes burst at 3 in the morning, Pierce showed up. When elevators stopped working on holidays, Pierce showed up. When tenants locked themselves out during snowstorms, Pierce showed up. The job wasn't glamorous. It wasn't supposed to be. Someone had to keep buildings functioning. Pierce understood that. For years, Madison seemed to understand it too. Then money entered the picture. Not suddenly, gradually. The kind of change that sneaks into a marriage without announcing itself. Madison started closing larger deals. A luxury condo downtown, a waterfront property in Vancouver, a historic home in Lake Oswego. Her commissions increased, then doubled, then tripled. Within 5 years, she was earning more than Pierce. Within 7 years, she was earning several times more. At first, Pierce celebrated every success. He framed one of her real estate magazine features and hung it in their hallway. He bought her a leather portfolio after her first 6-figure commission year. He listened to every story about difficult clients and bidding wars. But something else was changing. The more Madison succeeded, the more she seemed embarrassed by the things that hadn't changed. Pierce still drove the same Ford Ranger. Pierce still wore work boots. Pierce still fixed things himself instead of hiring contractors. Pierce still spent Saturday mornings repairing neighbors' broken fences. One evening they attended a fundraising event at a luxury hotel downtown. Pierce remembered it clearly, not because of anything dramatic, because of one sentence. A wealthy developer had asked Madison how she knew Pierce. The question sounded harmless. Madison laughed. Then she said, "He's my husband, he works maintenance." The room became quiet for half a second. Only half a second. But Pierce noticed. He always noticed. The developer smiled politely. The conversation moved on. Nobody said anything offensive. Nobody had to. The silence did the work. Driving home that night, Madison spent 20 minutes discussing potential clients. She never mentioned what happened. Pierce never brought it up. Still, something settled inside him. A small realization, not anger, not resentment, just understanding. The following years provided more examples. Madison began attending industry events alone. When clients visited the house, she sometimes referred to Pierce as working late, even when he was home. During dinner parties, conversations about careers seemed to stop whenever they reached him. People assumed he couldn't contribute. Pierce let them assume. Listening often revealed more than talking. Then Chelsea Morgan entered the picture. Chelsea was another realtor, divorced, successful, loud. The kind of person who treated every conversation like an audience existed nearby. She and Madison became close after working together on several luxury listings. Pierce disliked very few people. Chelsea became one of them. Not because she was rude directly, because she disguised insults as jokes. "Oh, Pierce, you're still driving that truck." Or, "I can't believe Madison makes more in a month than most people make all year." Or, "Must be nice having a wife who pays for everything." Always smiling, always laughing, always watching reactions. Pierce rarely gave her one. That seemed to irritate her even more. Over time, Chelsea's influence became visible. Madison's comments changed. Small at first, then sharper. She criticized Pierce's clothes, his truck, his job, his lack of ambition. One evening, she stood in their kitchen reviewing property listings on her tablet. Without looking up, she asked, "Have you ever thought about doing something bigger?" Pierce glanced over from the dishwasher he was repairing. "Bigger than what? Maintenance." He tightened a fitting under the sink. "What would that look like?" "I don't know." Her voice carried impatience. "Something more." More, the word hung in the room. Pierce understood what she meant. Not more money, more status, more visibility, more prestige. He finished repairing the leak. Water stopped dripping. The sink worked perfectly. Madison barely noticed. A few months later, she bought a Lexus, then joined a luxury country club, then hired a personal branding consultant. The house gradually filled with symbols of success: designer furniture, imported lighting, custom wine storage. Everything looked impressive. Everything photographed well. Pierce continued waking up at 5:15 every morning, continued working, continued paying attention. Because while Madison focused on appearances, Pierce focused on details. And details eventually tell stories. Stories that people don't intend to share. One rainy Thursday evening in October, Pierce returned home earlier than expected. A water main repair had been postponed. The house was quiet. Madison was showing a property in West Lynn. At least that's where she was supposed to be. Pierce placed groceries on the kitchen counter, then heard a notification sound. A laptop sat open on the dining table. Madison's laptop. The screen had awakened. An email preview appeared in the corner. Only 2 lines were visible. Most people would have ignored it. Pierce almost did. Then he saw a name he had never heard before. Brandon Keller. The subject line was simple. Last night was worth the risk. Pierce stood motionless beside the dining table. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. Nothing looked different, yet everything suddenly did. Pierce stared at the glowing screen, then slowly set the grocery bag down. For the first time in years, he felt the unmistakable sensation that something important had just revealed itself, and this time he wasn't going to look away. Pierce didn't touch the laptop, not immediately. He stood beside the dining table for several seconds looking at the glowing screen. The email notification disappeared. The house became quiet again. A year earlier, he probably would have confronted Madison the moment she walked through the door. Most husbands would. Most husbands would have demanded answers. Pierce didn't, because something about the message bothered him, not the possibility of betrayal, the confidence. People who were careful didn't write emails like that. People who thought they couldn't get caught did. He finished putting away the groceries, made himself coffee, sat at the kitchen counter, and waited. Madison arrived home shortly after 8. She looked tired, or at least she performed tiredness convincingly. She tossed her keys onto the counter, dropped her designer handbag onto a chair, then walked directly to the refrigerator. "Long day," she said. Pierce nodded. "Good showing, 3 offers." She smiled. "Probably 4 by tomorrow." Pierce took a sip of coffee. "That's good." Nothing in his voice changed. Nothing in his expression changed. Madison continued talking about clients and property values. Pierce listened, but now he listened differently. Every sentence felt slightly heavier. Every detail seemed worth remembering. That night, Madison fell asleep quickly. Pierce remained awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain outside, thinking, not about revenge, not about divorce, about facts. Facts mattered. Facts survived arguments. Facts survived emotions. If something was happening, he wanted to understand exactly what it was before making a move. The following morning, Pierce left for work as usual. Alder Ridge Residences occupied 3 city blocks in Portland's Pearl District. The property contained nearly 400 luxury apartments. Tenants called constantly. Broken elevators, leaking pipes, heating issues, door access systems. The work demanded attention. Pierce appreciated that. Problems inside buildings followed rules. Find the cause. Fix the cause. Move on. Human problems rarely work that way. By lunchtime, he had repaired 2 HVAC units and responded to an emergency plumbing issue on the 7th floor. Still, the email remained in the back of his mind. That evening, Madison left for what she described as a client dinner. Pierce waited 30 minutes, then sat at the dining room table. The laptop remained where she'd left it, unlocked, open, careless. He hesitated, not because he felt guilty, because he knew that once he looked, there would be no going back. Then he opened the email application. The name appeared again, Brandon Keller. Dozens of messages, not hundreds, dozens, enough. The oldest conversation dated back nearly 11 months. Pierce felt a cold pressure settle in his chest. Not explosive anger, not panic, confirmation. The messages became increasingly personal over time. Private dinners, hotel reservations, inside jokes, photographs, promises, plans. Pierce read carefully, slowly, methodically. Every date, every location, every timestamp. The affair wasn't recent. It had been happening for almost a year. He leaned back in the chair. The dining room suddenly felt much larger than before. For several minutes, he simply sat there. Then he noticed something unexpected. The emails weren't only personal. Some discussed money. At first, the references seemed harmless. Investment opportunities, property acquisitions, commission structures, business conversations. But the deeper Pierce looked, the stranger they became. One message mentioned transferring funds through a joint account. Another referenced an undeclared payment. A third discussed avoiding unnecessary reporting. Pierce frowned. That wasn't normal. He wasn't a lawyer, he wasn't an accountant, but he understood enough to recognize risk when he saw it. He grabbed a notebook, started writing dates, amounts, names, locations. Nothing fancy, just facts. By midnight, he had filled 6 pages. The next few weeks followed a pattern. Pierce said nothing. Madison noticed nothing. Meanwhile, Pierce quietly collected information. Hotel receipts, flight confirmations, property records, bank statements, nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just documents, records, evidence. Every evening he added another piece to the puzzle. What surprised him most wasn't Madison's behavior. It was Brandon Keller. The man appeared everywhere. Real estate investment groups, commercial property partnerships, luxury development projects. His name surfaced repeatedly, and each appearance seemed connected to money. One Saturday afternoon, Pierce drove to Lake Oswego to inspect a maintenance issue at one of the company's managed properties. During lunch, he stopped at a cafe overlooking the lake. Pure coincidence, at least initially. Then he saw them, Madison and Brandon, seated together on the outdoor patio, laughing. Neither noticed him. Pierce remained inside the cafe, far enough away to avoid attention, close enough to observe. Brandon looked exactly like the type of man Chelsea Morgan constantly praised. Expensive watch, tailored jacket, perfect haircut, the image of success. Madison looked comfortable beside him, comfortable enough to touch his hand, comfortable enough to forget the possibility of being seen. Pierce watched for less than 5 minutes, then left. He didn't take photographs, didn't create a scene, didn't approach the table. He already knew enough. The drive back to Portland felt strangely peaceful. The uncertainty was gone, the mystery was gone. Truth often hurt less than suspicion. At least truth had boundaries. A week later, Pierce scheduled a meeting, not with a private investigator, not with a divorce attorney, with Abigail Mercer. Abigail had practiced family law in Oregon for nearly 30 years. Pierce knew her through his parents. She occupied a modest office building near downtown Portland. Nothing flashy, nothing designed to impress. Exactly the type of place Pierce trusted. Abigail listened without interruption. Pierce brought copies of emails, financial records, property information, a timeline. When he finished speaking, Abigail remained silent for several moments. Then she folded her hands. "Do you want a divorce?" Pierce considered the question carefully. "I want the truth." "You already have most of it." "Maybe." Abigail studied him. "What are you hoping I'll tell you?" Pierce looked toward the office window. Rain streaked across the glass. "I think there's more going on than an affair." Abigail nodded slowly. "I think you're right." She spent nearly an hour reviewing the documents. The longer she reviewed them, the more serious her expression became. Finally, she closed the folder. "Pierce." "Yeah. Do not confront your wife." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Why?" "Because right now you're gathering information." She tapped the folder. "The second people know they're being investigated, they change behavior." Pierce remained silent. Abigail continued. "Keep records. Document everything. Stay calm. Let people make their own mistakes." Those words stayed with him. Let people make their own mistakes. As he left the office, Abigail handed back the folder. "One more thing." Pierce stopped. "If your wife decides to file for divorce first—" She paused. "Don't assume losing an argument means losing the outcome." Pierce remembered that sentence later, many times. At the moment, however, he didn't fully understand it. 3 weeks passed, then 4. The atmosphere inside the Sullivan home changed. Madison seemed distracted, restless, impatient. She spent more time on her phone, more time away from home, more nights claiming client obligations. Pierce continued observing, continued documenting, continued waiting. Then one Tuesday evening in January, he arrived home to find a large envelope sitting on the kitchen island. His name was printed across the front. The return address belonged to a downtown Portland law firm. Pierce already knew what it contained before he opened it. Still, he carefully removed the papers, read every page, then read them again. A petition for dissolution of marriage, filed by Madison Sullivan. After 9 years together, she had officially made her decision. Pierce placed the documents back inside the envelope. Outside, snow began falling across Portland. Inside the house, he heard Madison's car pulling into the driveway. And for the first time since finding Brandon Keller's name, Pierce felt something shift. Not grief, not anger, something closer to clarity. Because now, the game had finally moved into the open, and Madison had no idea how much Pierce already knew. Madison didn't cry when she filed for divorce. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look conflicted. The decision appeared to bring her relief. For weeks after the papers arrived, the Sullivan house became less like a home and more like a business negotiation waiting to happen. Pierce noticed the change immediately. Every conversation became transactional. Every interaction became measured. Madison no longer discussed future plans, no vacations, no holidays, no renovations. The marriage already existed in the past tense. One evening, she sat across from him at the kitchen island. A legal pad rested beside her laptop. She looked more like a broker preparing a property acquisition than a wife ending a 9-year marriage. "Trevor wants us to start discussing asset division." Pierce stirred his coffee. Okay. That response seemed to irritate her. She had become accustomed to people reacting emotionally. Clients, competitors, friends. Pierce's calmness gave her nothing to work with. She crossed her arms. That's all you have to say. What else would you like me to say? The question lingered between them. Madison looked away first. Over the next month, negotiations began, or at least they called them negotiations. From Pierce's perspective, they felt more like demands. Trevor Bishop represented Madison. His office occupied the 23rd floor of a modern glass tower downtown. Everything about Trevor projected confidence. Expensive suits, expensive watches, expensive furniture. The kind of lawyer who wanted clients to feel they had already won before entering a courtroom. Abigail Mercer couldn't have been more different. Her office furniture looked older than some of her clients. She cared more about facts than appearances. Pierce appreciated that. The first settlement proposal arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Abigail placed the document on her conference table. Neither of them spoke while Pierce read. Page after page, line after line. When he finished, he leaned back. The proposal was aggressive, very aggressive. Madison wanted the Lake Oswego house, the Lexus, most of their savings, the joint investment account, the designer furniture, the artwork, the wine collection, the vacation fund, several pieces of jewelry purchased during the marriage, nearly everything. Abigail studied his face. What do you think? Pierce looked down at the document again, not because he was surprised, because he wasn't. This was exactly what he expected. Anything else? He asked. Abigail almost smiled. You're asking the wrong person. A week later, they met in Trevor's office. Madison arrived first. Trevor sat beside her. Pierce sat across the table with Abigail. The atmosphere felt strangely familiar, like one of the commercial lease negotiations Pierce occasionally witnessed at work. Everyone pretending to be reasonable, everyone calculating something. Trevor adjusted his tie. My client would like a clean and efficient resolution. Pierce nodded. That's fine. Trevor continued. Given the income disparity between the parties and the asset structure involved, we believe the proposal is fair. Pierce glanced toward Madison. She seemed very comfortable, very certain. The confidence wasn't difficult to understand. From the outside, the situation looked obvious. Madison earned significantly more money. Madison had the stronger social network. Madison appeared successful. Pierce appeared ordinary. Most observers would predict the outcome within 30 seconds. Trevor slid a revised spreadsheet across the table. Columns, numbers, percentages, property values, estimated distributions. Pierce reviewed every page carefully. Not one reaction escaped him, not one complaint, not one argument. Finally, Trevor leaned forward. Mr. Sullivan, do you have concerns? Pierce placed the document down. One question. Madison immediately looked up. Trevor folded his hands. Go ahead. Pierce's voice remained calm. Is that everything? The room became quiet. Madison frowned. Trevor blinked. Everything. The assets Madison wants. Trevor exchanged a quick glance with his client, then nodded. As outlined, yes. Pierce looked toward Madison. She held his gaze. For a brief moment, he remembered the woman from the coffee shop 9 years earlier, the woman who cried over flowers. That woman seemed very far away. Okay, Pierce said. Madison's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She had expected resistance, an argument, a fight, something. Instead, she received agreement. Trevor cleared his throat. I'm sorry, are you saying you accept the framework? Mostly. The lawyer looked genuinely surprised. What changes would you like? Pierce turned several pages, then pointed to a few items. I'd like to keep my Ford Ranger. Madison laughed softly, not a cruel laugh, a dismissive one. Trevor nodded. Fine, Pierce continued. I want the storage box in the garage. Madison frowned. The old file box. Yes, she shrugged. Take it. Trevor made a note. Anything else? Pierce thought briefly. My personal checking account. Trevor reviewed the balance. Less than $20,000. Compared to the rest of the marital assets, it barely registered. No objection, he said. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Afterward, Abigail and Pierce walked toward the parking garage. Rain covered the sidewalks. Portland looked gray and cold. Abigail stopped beside her car. You're planning something. Pierce looked at her. No, that's not true. He smiled faintly. Abigail rarely missed details. She continued. Most people fight over assets. Pierce nodded. Most people do. And you're not. No. Abigail studied him carefully. Why? Pierce looked across the street. Traffic lights reflected against wet pavement. For several seconds he remained silent. Then he answered, because people focus on value. Abigail waited. Pierce continued, they don't pay attention to obligations. The lawyer's eyes narrowed slightly. Now she understood, or at least part of it. Back at home, Pierce spent the evening reviewing documents, not settlement documents, property records, tax filings, mortgage disclosures, repair permits, insurance paperwork, everything connected to the Lake Oswego house. The property looked impressive. 4 bedrooms, private landscaping, large windows, a view that helped justify its 7-figure valuation. Madison loved that house. She had fought for it from the moment they purchased it. She featured it constantly on social media. Photos by the fireplace, photos beside the pool, photos from charity events. To most people, the house symbolized success. Pierce knew something different, because Pierce had read every document, twice, maybe 3 times. Over the years, he had noticed problems, not catastrophic problems, complicated problems, deferred repair obligations, contractor disputes, permit questions, a pending issue involving renovation financing. Nothing alarming individually. Together they created risk. Risk that required attention. Risk Madison never wanted to discuss. Every time Pierce raised concerns, she dismissed them. The house kept appreciating. That's all she cared about. Appreciation covered mistakes. Until it didn't. Late one night, Abigail called. The settlement draft had arrived, updated, ready for signatures. Pierce reviewed the language carefully. One paragraph attracted his attention, a section assigning future responsibility for liabilities attached to transferred assets. He read it 3 times, then called Abigail. Leave that clause exactly where it is. There was silence on the line. Then Abigail said quietly, I thought you might say that. For the first time since the divorce process began, she sounded almost impressed, not because Pierce was being aggressive, because he wasn't. He was doing something far more dangerous. He was allowing people to make choices, and those choices were becoming legally documented. A few days later, Madison called him into the living room. Several moving estimates sat on the coffee table. She looked confident, victorious even. Looks like we're almost done. Pierce nodded. Looks that way. Madison folded her arms. You know this would have been much harder if you'd fought me. Pierce met her eyes. For a second, neither spoke. Then he answered, Maybe. Madison smiled. Certain she had won. Certain the outcome had already been decided. Pierce said nothing else. Because the most important parts of the settlement weren't the things Madison was taking. The most important parts were the things attached to them, and Madison hadn't noticed those at all. The house sat on a quiet street in Lake Oswego, hidden behind mature cedar trees and carefully maintained landscaping. From the outside, it looked perfect. That was part of the problem. People trusted appearances. Pierce never had. The first time he walked through the property nearly 6 years earlier, Madison had fallen in love before they reached the 2nd floor. The staircase, the stone fireplace, the oversized kitchen, the backyard patio overlooking a small wooded area. She wanted it immediately. Pierce remembered standing near the dining room windows while their realtor discussed pricing. Even then, he noticed details others ignored. Hairline cracks near one corner of the foundation, signs of previous water intrusion in the basement, Evidence of rushed remodeling work, nothing catastrophic, nothing that would stop a purchase, but enough to make him cautious. Madison saw a dream home. Pierce saw a list of future responsibilities. They bought it anyway. At the time, the decision seemed reasonable. Property values in Lake Oswego were climbing rapidly. Interest rates remained favorable. Madison's income was increasing every year. The future looked secure. For a while it was. Then the repairs began. First came drainage problems after a particularly heavy winter, then a retaining wall issue near the rear property line, then unexpected electrical work connected to an earlier renovation performed by a previous owner. Every repair required money. Every repair required paperwork. Every repair created new files. Pierce kept all of them. He always kept records, invoices, permits, engineering reports, insurance correspondence, contractor estimates. Everything went into storage boxes. Everything received labels. Madison laughed about it sometimes. "You keep documents like we're running a law firm." Pierce usually smiled. Maybe he did. Years of maintenance work had taught him a simple lesson. Problems rarely appeared without warning. Most people simply ignored the warning signs. One particular incident stayed in his memory. 3 years before the divorce, a contractor named Eric Holloway completed major renovation work on the west side of the house. The project included structural modifications and exterior upgrades. The work looked beautiful afterward. Madison loved it. The property photographs became some of her favorites, but several months later disagreements emerged. Billing disputes, change orders, questions regarding additional costs. The situation never escalated into a lawsuit, at least not officially. Still, Pierce remembered the tension. He remembered letters, phone calls, meetings, promises. Then there was the financing. Madison had insisted on expanding the renovation budget, new outdoor living space, custom finishes, landscape improvements, additional upgrades. The original budget grew quickly, so did the obligations attached to it. Whenever Pierce suggested slowing down, Madison dismissed the concerns. "You're always worried about worst-case scenarios." Maybe he was, but worst-case scenarios happened. That was why they had names. Months before the divorce filing, Pierce had reviewed several financial documents connected to the property, mostly routine. Mortgage statements, tax records, insurance updates. Then he noticed inconsistencies, nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just details that required attention, the kind of details most people skipped. Outstanding obligations, future payment schedules, certain clauses buried inside financing agreements. The house generated admiration. The paperwork generated concern. Madison cared about one, Pierce cared about the other. Now, sitting inside Abigail Mercer's office, he reviewed those same records once again. Abigail flipped through several folders. "You've organized all of this yourself?" Pierce nodded. "Over the years." The attorney looked impressed. Many clients arrived carrying emotions. Very few arrived carrying documentation. Abigail pointed toward a specific page. "Did Madison ever review these?" Pierce almost laughed. "Probably not." The answer wasn't criticism, just reality. Madison rarely read beyond summaries. Pierce read everything. That difference mattered, especially now. The divorce process accelerated throughout February. Trevor Bishop continued pushing for a quick settlement. Every communication carried the same underlying message. Sign. Move on. Don't complicate things. Madison appeared eager to finish as well. She already behaved like someone entering a new chapter, new social circles, new events. More evenings away from home, more weekends occupied elsewhere. Pierce noticed. He documented. He remained silent. One afternoon, Chelsea Morgan visited the house. Pierce arrived home while they were sitting in the kitchen drinking wine. The conversation stopped briefly when he entered, then resumed. Chelsea smiled. "Pierce." He nodded politely. "Chelsea." She glanced around the kitchen. "Madison was just telling me everything is almost finalized." Pierce placed his keys on the counter. Sounds like it. Chelsea exchanged a look with Madison, the kind of look people share when they think they understand a situation completely. We're all proud of her. Pierce said nothing. Chelsea continued anyway. It takes courage to start over. Madison smiled. Pierce recognized the performance. The narrative had already been written. Successful woman leaves stagnant husband, rebuilds life, thrives. The story sounded clean, simple, easy to explain at parties. Reality rarely was. A few minutes later, Pierce excused himself and headed toward the garage. The storage box sat exactly where it always had. Old, dust-covered, unremarkable. Madison considered it junk. Chelsea probably wouldn't have noticed it. Pierce opened the lid. Inside sat years of records, property files, correspondence, financial statements, permits, inspection reports. Every document connected to the house. Every document connected to decisions Madison barely remembered making. He closed the box again, carefully, because the value inside had nothing to do with money. 2 weeks later, the final settlement draft arrived. Abigail called immediately. Come by the office. Pierce drove downtown after work. Rain struck the windshield during most of the trip. Typical Portland weather. Inside the conference room, Abigail handed him the revised agreement. Pierce reviewed every page, then reviewed them again. Nothing escaped his attention, especially not the language assigning responsibility for transferred assets. The wording was precise, very precise. Any future claims, outstanding obligations, associated liabilities, financial responsibilities, everything connected to the Lake Oswego property would follow ownership, and ownership would belong entirely to Madison. Abigail watched him finish reading. You understand what this means? It wasn't a question. Pierce nodded. Yes. The attorney folded her hands. Most people would fight to keep a property like that. Pierce looked down at the paperwork. The house was worth more than $1 million. Beautiful location, strong market value, impressive appearance. Yet all he could see were the documents attached to it. The obligations, the unresolved issues, the future risks. Sometimes valuable things carried expensive shadows. Abigail leaned back. You're certain? Pierce answered immediately. Yes. No hesitation, no uncertainty, because the decision had already been made long before the settlement existed. People assumed divorce battles were won by taking more. Pierce wasn't convinced. Sometimes winning meant avoiding the wrong thing entirely. The final signing date arrived the following week. Everyone gathered in Trevor Bishop's office. Madison looked confident. Trevor looked pleased. Abigail looked patient. Pierce looked exactly as he always did. Calm, prepared, observant. The documents moved around the table. Pages turned. Pens clicked. Signatures appeared. Madison signed quickly, almost eagerly. Trevor reviewed each page with satisfaction. Then the final property transfer documents arrived. The Lake Oswego house. The centerpiece. The prize. The asset Madison wanted most. She signed first, then pushed the papers across the table. Pierce picked up the pen. For a brief moment he stared at the page. Not because he regretted the decision, because he understood it completely. The house wasn't leaving his life. The consequences attached to it were. He signed. Abigail quietly collected the completed documents. Trevor smiled. Madison smiled. Everyone appeared satisfied. Everyone except Abigail. Not because she disagreed with the outcome, because she understood something the others didn't. As they exited the conference room, she placed one particular document into her briefcase, the page containing the liability assignment clause. A single paragraph, easy to overlook, easy to underestimate. Yet Abigail suspected that one paragraph might eventually become the most important page in the entire divorce. And somewhere deep inside, Pierce suspected the same thing. The official divorce decree arrived on a Tuesday morning. 9 years of marriage reduced to a stack of stamped documents inside a large white envelope. Pierce opened it at the kitchen counter. The house was quiet, almost empty now. Most of Madison's attention had shifted elsewhere long before the marriage legally ended. He reviewed every page one final time, not because he doubted the outcome, because habits were difficult to break. Details mattered, signatures mattered, dates mattered, especially dates. When he finished reading, he placed the documents into the same storage box he had fought to keep. Then he walked upstairs. The moving truck would arrive in 3 hours. For the first time since buying the Lake Oswego house, Pierce viewed it as a visitor. The master bedroom looked larger without emotion attached to it. The hallway seemed strangely unfamiliar. The expensive kitchen Madison loved no longer felt important. A house changed when it stopped being home. Pierce packed quietly. 2 duffel bags, several boxes, tools, work clothes, personal documents, books, photographs, nothing more. The process took less than 4 hours. 9 years. 4 hours. Life could be surprisingly efficient when stripped down to essentials. Around noon, one of the movers glanced toward the nearly empty garage. "That's it," Pierce smiled. "That's it." The man looked confused. Most divorces involved arguments over possessions. Furniture, electronics, decorations, televisions. Pierce left most of it behind, not because he couldn't keep it, because he didn't want it. By late afternoon, only one item remained inside the garage, the old storage box. Dust covered its corners. The cardboard edges had begun showing signs of age. It looked worthless. Madison walked into the garage as Pierce loaded it into the truck. "You're really taking that thing." "Yeah," she laughed softly. "You've kept that box longer than you've kept some friendships." Pierce closed the tailgate. "Probably." Madison shook her head. She genuinely didn't understand. The box represented paperwork, records, history. She considered those things boring. Pierce considered them useful. The difference had always existed. Now it mattered more than ever. The movers left first. Pierce remained behind for several minutes, standing alone in the driveway, looking at the house one last time. No dramatic memories flooded back. No overwhelming sadness. No urge to change his mind. Only quiet acceptance. The house belonged to Madison now, completely, along with everything attached to it. He climbed into his Ford Ranger, started the engine, and drove away. The truck's odometer showed nearly 200,000 miles. The driver's seat fabric had begun wearing thin. The paint carried years of scratches and weather damage. Pierce loved it, not because it was valuable, because it was honest. Nothing about the truck pretended to be something it wasn't. 40 minutes later, he arrived at his new apartment, a small studio near East Burnside. 1 room, 1 bathroom, simple furniture, simple lease, simple life. The building wasn't impressive. No concierge, no luxury amenities, no rooftop deck. Pierce liked it immediately. That evening, he sat beside the window eating takeout Chinese food from a nearby restaurant. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Traffic moved through downtown Portland below. The silence felt different now, lighter, not happy, not sad, just lighter. His phone buzzed. A text message appeared from an unknown number, Chelsea Morgan. Apparently, Madison had shared it. The message contained a single sentence. "Hope you're doing okay." Pierce stared at the screen, then placed the phone face down on the table. He never replied. The next few weeks settled into a routine. Wake up, work, return home, sleep, repeat. Alder Ridge residences continued generating problems. Tenants locked themselves out. Appliances failed. Water heaters leaked. Life moved forward. Most of his co-workers knew about the divorce. News traveled quickly inside large workplaces. Several people expressed sympathy. Others tried offering advice. Pierce accepted neither. He simply continued working. One Friday afternoon, a younger maintenance technician named Tyler asked a question while they repaired a damaged access gate. "You okay?" Pierce looked up. "Sure." Tyler hesitated. "I heard your wife got the house." Pierce tightened a bolt. "She did." And the savings, most of it. Tyler stared. Damn. Pierce smiled slightly. The reaction wasn't unusual. Everyone viewed divorce like a scoreboard. Who won, who lost, who got more, who got less. Very few people examined the full picture. Pierce had stopped caring about appearances months ago. Life goes on, he said. Tyler looked unconvinced. Maybe one day he'd understand. Maybe not. That weekend, Madison celebrated. Pierce learned about it accidentally, not through Madison, not through mutual friends, through social media. Someone at work showed him photographs. A party at the Emerald Room, an upscale restaurant overlooking the Willamette River, champagne glasses, luxury dresses, expensive suits. Chelsea appeared in nearly every picture. So did Brandon Keller. The photographs told a story: fresh start, new beginning, successful woman thriving after divorce. The comments beneath the posts followed predictable patterns. You deserve happiness. Proud of you. Living your best life. Power move. Pierce looked at 3 photos, then handed the phone back. He didn't feel anger, only distance, like watching strangers celebrate something unrelated to his life. Meanwhile, Madison's world appeared to expand. Pierce's became smaller, and he preferred it that way. The studio apartment stayed clean, quiet, predictable. No arguments, no tension, no performances, just peace. Abigail called occasionally to check in, mostly brief conversations, legal housekeeping, administrative questions. One afternoon, she mentioned something interesting. Trevor seems unusually pleased with himself. Pierce smiled. Why? He thinks he crushed you. Pierce laughed quietly. The sound surprised even him. Maybe he did. Abigail didn't respond immediately. Then she said, "That's not what I think." The conversation ended a few minutes later, but her words remained with him. A month passed, then another. Spring arrived. Portland's gray skies slowly gave way to longer days. Pierce settled into his new life. Until a Thursday afternoon in late April. The call came while he was replacing a failed water pump in one of Alder Ridge's mechanical rooms. An unfamiliar Seattle number appeared on his phone. Normally, he ignored unknown calls. Something made him answer. Pierce Sullivan. A professional voice responded. "Mr. Sullivan, this is Rebecca Jensen from North River Energy Systems." Pierce froze, not visibly, but internally. North River, a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in months. Maybe years, not because it wasn't important, because almost nobody knew it existed. The woman continued. "We've been trying to reach you regarding shareholder communications." Pierce stepped away from the equipment room. The noise of machinery faded behind him. His heartbeat slowed, then steadied, because he already suspected what this call might mean. And if he was right, everything that had happened during the divorce was about to become much more complicated. "Go ahead," he said. Rebecca paused, then delivered a sentence Pierce had been waiting years to hear. "There's been a significant development regarding acquisition negotiations." Pierce stared down the hallway. The world around him suddenly felt very still. Whatever happened next would change everything, and Madison Sullivan had absolutely no idea it was coming. Pierce stood alone in the service hallway outside Alder Ridge's mechanical room long after the phone call ended. The sounds of the building slowly returned, air handlers humming, water circulating through pipes. A distant elevator bell, normal sounds, ordinary sounds. Yet the conversation with Rebecca Jensen had changed something. Not because it made Pierce rich, not yet. Because it confirmed that a chapter of his life he had nearly forgotten was suddenly becoming relevant again. He slipped his phone into his pocket, then walked back into the mechanical room. The water pump still needed replacing. Tenants still expected hot water. Work remained work. And Pierce had never been the type to abandon responsibility because something exciting happened. 2 hours later, however, he found himself thinking about a garage in Vancouver, Washington. A small garage, a very different life. Nearly 15 years earlier, back when North River Energy Systems wasn't a company, back when it was little more than an idea. Back then, Pierce had a close friend named Ethan Walker. They met while attending a technical training seminar in Seattle. Ethan possessed the kind of mind that constantly built things, modified things, improved things. If someone gave Ethan a machine, he immediately wanted to know how to make it better. Pierce appreciated people like that, because maintenance work taught respect for engineering. Good engineering solved problems. Bad engineering created them. Over time, the friendship grew. Weekend projects became common. Most involved tools, metal, batteries, electrical systems, things neither man's wife found particularly interesting. One project eventually became different. Ethan had developed a concept involving modular energy storage systems. The idea wasn't glamorous. No flashy apps, no social media platform, no cryptocurrency, just technology designed to help commercial buildings store energy more efficiently. Pierce helped where he could, testing prototypes, building housings, identifying practical issues, offering feedback from years of maintenance experience. Many evenings ended with pizza boxes scattered across workbenches while the two men argued about design improvements. At the time, nobody imagined it would become anything significant, especially Madison. One particular evening remained vivid in Pierce's memory. The couple had attended a dinner party hosted by Chelsea Morgan several years earlier. The conversation eventually turned toward careers and investments. Someone asked Pierce about his weekend projects. Before he could answer, Madison laughed. "Oh, it's just another one of Ethan's garage inventions." The group chuckled politely. Madison continued, "They're trying to build the next billion-dollar company from a workshop." More laughter. Pierce remembered looking down at his drink. Not embarrassed, not angry, just aware. Aware that Madison viewed certain ambitions as worthy only if they already succeeded. Success created legitimacy. Failure created ridicule. The project continued anyway. Years passed. Investors appeared. Small contracts followed, then larger ones. Ethan formally incorporated the company, North River Energy Systems. Pierce became an early shareholder, not because he invested large amounts of money, because Ethan insisted. "You helped build this thing." Pierce initially resisted. Ethan refused to accept no. Eventually, a trust structure established years earlier by Pierce's father held the shares. The arrangement was simple, legal, documented, and most importantly, created long before Pierce married Madison. Over time, the shares faded into the background. Life became busy. Marriage became complicated. Work consumed attention. North River slowly expanded. Pierce occasionally received updates, annual reports, shareholder communications, financial summaries. Most ended up filed inside his storage box. The company mattered, but not enough to dominate his life. Until now, 3 days after Rebecca's call, Pierce drove to Seattle. The meeting took place inside a modern office overlooking Elliott Bay. The contrast amused him. The last time he discussed North River in person had been inside Ethan's cluttered garage. Now there were conference rooms, receptionists, corporate branding, security badges, people wearing expensive suits. Ethan greeted him personally. 15 years had added gray hair, but not much else. The same energy remained, the same restless enthusiasm. He shook Pierce's hand firmly. "Good to see you." "You too." They entered a private conference room. Several executives joined them. So did Rebecca Jensen. Folders waited at each seat. Pierce immediately recognized the seriousness. Companies didn't organize meetings like this for routine updates. Ethan wasted little time. "We've received a formal acquisition proposal." The room fell silent. Even though Pierce already suspected, the news, hearing it aloud, felt different. Numbers appeared on a screen, financial projections, valuations, terms, growth forecasts, potential outcomes. Pierce listened carefully. The proposal came from a national energy infrastructure corporation based in Denver. Months of negotiations had already occurred under strict confidentiality agreements. Nothing was finalized. But discussions were progressing rapidly, very rapidly. When the presentation ended, Ethan looked directly at Pierce. "You understand why we've been quiet?" Pierce nodded. "Of course." Confidentiality agreements surrounded every aspect of the process. Shareholders couldn't discuss details publicly, couldn't disclose negotiations, couldn't speculate. The rules were clear. Pierce appreciated clarity. As the meeting continued, one reality became impossible to ignore. If the acquisition succeeded, the value of his shares would increase dramatically. Not comfortably, dramatically. Life-changing amounts. Amounts that would surprise anyone who believed Pierce Sullivan was merely a maintenance supervisor with an aging truck. For a brief moment, Madison entered his thoughts. Not emotionally, logically. He imagined her reaction, the assumptions, the accusations, the questions. Then he dismissed the thought, because the facts were simple. The shares predated the marriage. The trust predated the marriage. The documentation existed. Everything had been disclosed appropriately. Everything had been legal. Everything had been reviewed. Truth didn't become less true simply because someone disliked it. After the meeting ended, Ethan walked with Pierce toward the parking garage. Seattle rain drifted across the waterfront. The city looked gray and reflective, very similar to Portland. "You okay?" Ethan asked. Pierce smiled. "Sure." "You don't seem excited." "I am," Ethan laughed. "No, you're not." Pierce considered that. Maybe Ethan was right. Excitement wasn't the correct word. Relief felt closer. Not relief because of money. Relief because years of uncertainty were ending. The project had survived. The company had survived. The sacrifices had meant something. Before they parted ways, Ethan stopped beside Pierce's truck. "I heard about the divorce." Pierce nodded. Word traveled, especially among old friends. Ethan looked uncomfortable. Bad timing. Pierce followed his gaze toward the water. "Maybe." Then he smiled slightly. "Maybe good timing, too." Ethan seemed confused. Pierce didn't explain, because explaining required details, and details would eventually reveal themselves without assistance. The following weeks passed quietly. North River negotiations continued behind closed doors. Pierce returned to his normal routine. Work, home, sleep, repeat. No celebration, no dramatic lifestyle changes, no expensive purchases. If anything, his life appeared more ordinary than ever. Meanwhile, Madison's life seemed increasingly public. Social media posts multiplied. Professional photographs, networking events, luxury property showcases. Brandon Keller appeared frequently, always smiling, always successful, always visible. Pierce observed from a distance, not because he cared, because observation had become habit. One Friday evening, Abigail called. Her tone sounded casual, too casual. "How's Seattle?" Pierce laughed. "Ethan called you." "Of course he did." She paused, then asked the obvious question. "Is it real?" Pierce stared out the apartment window. Lights reflected across wet pavement below. "Looks like it." Abigail remained silent for several seconds. Finally, she said, "Interesting." That single word carried more meaning than most conversations, because Abigail understood the implications, not financial implications, legal implications. The difference mattered. Before ending the call, she offered one final piece of advice. "Don't tell anyone." Pierce smiled. "I wasn't planning to." "Good." Another pause. Then, "Especially not Madison." The line disconnected. Pierce set the phone down. Outside, rain continued falling across Portland. Inside the studio apartment, everything remained quiet. Simple. Predictable. For now. Because somewhere beyond his view, acquisition negotiations continued moving forward. And if they reached the finish line, a secret Madison once mocked as a garage fantasy would soon become impossible to ignore. 6 months after the divorce, Madison Sullivan looked exactly like someone who believed she had won. The photographs suggested it. The interviews suggested it. The carefully crafted online image suggested it. Everything in her world appeared to be moving upward. The Lake Oswego house had become the centerpiece of her personal brand. Every room seemed designed for a camera. Professional lighting, fresh renovations, custom staging, seasonal decorations. Madison posted constantly. Breakfast beside the stone fireplace, wine on the patio at sunset, business meetings in the outdoor lounge area, luxury real estate tips filmed in front of floor-to-ceiling windows. The message was obvious. Success, independence, reinvention. Thousands of people believed it. Most never questioned what happened outside the frame. Pierce occasionally saw the posts, not because he followed her. He didn't. Mutual acquaintances often shared them. Co-workers mentioned them. Chelsea Morgan practically treated social media as a full-time occupation. Images traveled, stories traveled, appearances traveled. Reality moved more slowly. One evening, Tyler approached Pierce during a maintenance inspection. "Hey," Pierce looked up from a control panel. "Yeah," Tyler hesitated, then held up his phone. "Isn't that your ex-wife?" Pierce glanced at the screen. Madison stood beside Brandon Keller at a luxury networking event in downtown Portland. Both smiled at the camera, champagne glasses in hand. A caption below the image read, "Building the future with the right people." Pierce handed the phone back. "Looks like her." Tyler frowned. "You're weirdly calm about this." Pierce returned his attention to the equipment. "I don't spend much time thinking about it." That answer surprised Tyler, but it was true. Pierce spent his days solving real problems. The pressure valve that failed last week, the elevator inspection scheduled for Tuesday, the leaking pipe above Unit 814, practical things, concrete things. Meanwhile, Madison's life became increasingly expensive. The renovations on the Lake Oswego property continued. A redesigned outdoor entertainment area, landscape upgrades, new custom furniture, additional cosmetic improvements. The spending accelerated. So did the borrowing. Pierce knew because some of the public filings crossed his desk through documents Abigail occasionally reviewed. Not because he was investigating Madison, because certain legal notifications still referenced historical records connected to the property. Every time something arrived, Pierce forwarded it to Abigail. Nothing more, nothing less. The process had become routine. One Friday afternoon, another envelope arrived. Official, certified. The return address belonged to a county office. Pierce carried it directly to Abigail's office after work. She opened the document carefully, read several pages, then read them again. The expression on her face changed. Not dramatically, just enough. "What is it?" Pierce asked. Abigail placed the pages on her desk. "Remember those contractor disputes?" Pierce nodded. "The renovation issues?" "Yes." She tapped the document. "They're reopening part of the review." Pierce remained silent. Abigail continued. "It may be nothing." Neither of them believed that. Lawyers rarely used certified mail for nothing, especially government offices, especially months after a divorce settlement. Pierce looked toward the document. "What do they want?" "Records." "About what payments?" The answer landed heavily, not because it created panic, because it fit a pattern. A pattern Pierce had quietly noticed months earlier. Money moving through places it probably shouldn't. Numbers that didn't quite match. Transactions connected to Brandon Keller. At the time, those observations felt incomplete. Now they felt connected. Abigail closed the file. "Keep every document." Pierce almost smiled. "Always do." That answer earned the first genuine laugh Abigail had offered all afternoon. The following weeks brought more letters, more requests, more questions, nothing directed at Pierce personally. Everything focused on records, property records, payment records, contract records, financial records. Government agencies tended to move slowly, then suddenly. Pierce understood that from experience. The first signs often appeared long before the actual consequences. Meanwhile, Madison continued expanding her public image. One local magazine featured her in an article about women in luxury real estate. Another publication highlighted her business growth. Professional photographers captured images throughout the Lake Oswego property. Every photograph reinforced the same narrative. A woman thriving after adversity, a woman creating success through determination, a woman moving forward. Nobody photographed the filing cabinets, nobody photographed the debt, nobody photographed the paperwork. Those things weren't attractive. Pierce understood that. Reality rarely photographed well. One Saturday morning, he drove past the house accidentally while responding to an emergency maintenance consultation for a friend. The route happened to pass through Lake Oswego. The property looked immaculate, fresh landscaping, fresh paint, luxury vehicles in the driveway. Everything appeared perfect. As he waited at a traffic light nearby, he noticed several workers unloading materials from a contractor truck. Another renovation project, another improvement, another expense. The light changed. Pierce continued driving. No bitterness, no jealousy, just observation. A week later, Rebecca Jensen called again. North River's acquisition negotiations continued advancing. The numbers discussed during earlier meetings had increased. Several competing bidders had entered conversations. The company value continued rising. Pierce listened quietly, asked a few practical questions, took notes, then returned to work. Rebecca finally laughed. "You may be the calmest shareholder I've ever spoken to." Pierce smiled. "I fix boilers for a living." "I'm serious." "So am I." The truth was simple. Money excited people. Money terrified people. Money changed people. Pierce had watched all three happen repeatedly throughout his life. He preferred caution. Caution lasted longer. That same evening, Abigail called. Her voice sounded different, more serious than usual. "I need to show you something." Pierce drove downtown immediately. When he arrived, several files already sat open on her conference table. Highlighted sections, sticky notes, printed records. Abigail pointed toward one particular page. "Look here." Pierce leaned forward. A series of transactions appeared. Amounts, dates, account references, several names. One name appeared repeatedly. Brandon Keller. Pierce studied the pages, then another, then another. A familiar feeling settled over him, the same feeling he'd experienced months earlier when reading Madison's emails. Not surprise, recognition. Abigail folded her arms. "The people reviewing these records are asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that don't disappear." Pierce looked back down. The transactions seemed small individually, larger collectively. Patterns rarely depended on individual details. Patterns depended on repetition, and there was definitely a pattern. Abigail lowered her voice. "This is still preliminary." Pierce nodded. "I know." "But if they're looking at these records..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Pierce already understood. Investigations often started quietly. Letters, requests, documentation. Then came audits, reviews, interviews, subpoenas. The machine moved slowly until it didn't. Several days later, another certified letter arrived. This one wasn't addressed to Pierce. It was delivered mistakenly because of an old forwarding record connected to the Lake Oswego property. He recognized the sender immediately. Oregon Department of Revenue. Pierce stared at the envelope for several seconds, then placed it back inside its mailing sleeve. Unopened, untouched, exactly as required. The next morning, Abigail handled the transfer through proper channels. By afternoon, confirmation showed it had been delivered. Pierce sat alone in his apartment that evening. Rain tapped against the window. The city lights shimmered across wet streets below. His phone remained silent. No calls from Madison, no messages, no accusations, nothing. She probably didn't even realize what was beginning. Yet somewhere inside a government office, someone was reviewing records, comparing numbers, following transactions, connecting dates. And for the first time since the divorce became final, Pierce sensed the balance shifting, not because he was doing anything, because facts were, and facts had a habit of arriving exactly when people least expected them. The first official request arrived on a Wednesday. Not a lawsuit, not a criminal charge, not even a subpoena. Just a request for records. Simple, professional, routine. The kind of document most people underestimated. Pierce didn't. He had spent enough years dealing with inspections, compliance reviews, and property audits to understand one thing. Serious investigations rarely began with dramatic headlines. They began with paperwork, a lot of paperwork. The letter came from the Oregon Department of Revenue. A second request followed from a state review office connected to property transactions. Then a third, different agency. Similar questions, similar dates, similar names. By themselves, none seemed extraordinary. Together, they created a pattern, and patterns mattered. Pierce sat across from Abigail Mercer on a rainy Thursday afternoon while she organized the growing stack of documents. The conference room table had slowly transformed into a map. Timelines, property records, financial records, contractor invoices, transaction summaries. Abigail pointed towards several highlighted entries. Look at the dates. Pierce did. Several transactions connected directly to renovation work performed on the Lake Oswego property. Others connected to real estate commissions. A few involved accounts associated with Brandon Keller. Not enough to prove wrongdoing, enough to generate questions. Abigail folded her hands. They're following the money. Pierce nodded. Looks that way. What concerns me isn't the size. She tapped a page. It's the inconsistencies. That word stayed with him. Inconsistencies, not fraud, not guilt, not accusations. Inconsistencies. The language of investigators. The language of people gathering facts. Exactly the language Pierce trusted most, because facts had no emotions attached. A week later, he received another call, this time from a state investigator. The woman introduced herself politely, professional, direct. She asked if he would be willing to answer questions regarding certain property-related transactions. Pierce agreed immediately. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. After hanging up, he returned to work. No panic, no urgency, just another appointment. Meanwhile, Madison appeared completely unaware of what was happening, or perhaps she believed it wasn't serious. Social media suggested business continued normally. New listings, networking events, luxury open houses, photographs beside Brandon Keller. Everything looked successful. Everything looked controlled. Pierce watched none of it directly, but fragments reached him anyway. People talked. People always talked, especially when someone worked hard to maintain an image. The interview took place inside a government office building in Salem. Nothing about the location felt intimidating. No dramatic interrogation rooms, no detectives leaning across tables, just fluorescent lights, gray carpeting, conference rooms, normal people doing administrative work. Pierce appreciated that. Truth usually lived inside ordinary places. The investigator introduced herself as Diane Foster, mid-50s, sharp eyes, calm demeanor, the type of person who probably noticed details others missed. Pierce liked her immediately. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. Diane asked questions. Pierce answered them, carefully, honestly, nothing more, nothing less. She requested records. Pierce provided records. Emails, invoices, property documents, correspondence. Every document carried dates. Every document carried timestamps. Every document told part of a story. Halfway through the meeting, Diane stopped reviewing paperwork. She looked directly at Pierce. I have to ask. Okay. Why did you keep all of this? Pierce glanced at the folders. The answer seemed obvious. Because it existed. Diane smiled slightly. Most people didn't think that way. Most people discarded records. Deleted emails, lost receipts, forgot details. Pierce never had. Maintenance work rewarded documentation. If a boiler failed 3 years later, records mattered. If a contractor disputed an invoice, records mattered. If someone claimed something never happened, records mattered. The principle remained the same everywhere. Diane returned to her notes. The meeting continued. Toward the end, another name surfaced repeatedly: Brandon Keller. The investigator never accused him of anything. She simply asked questions: business relationships, property projects, financial connections, commission structures, dates, locations, timelines. The questions became increasingly specific. Pierce noticed. So did Diane. Finally, she closed the final folder. "Thank you. No problem." She hesitated, then added, "You've been very helpful." Pierce stood. "Glad to help." As he prepared to leave, Diane asked one final question, a question that caught him off guard. "Why didn't you fight the divorce settlement?" For a moment, the room became very quiet. Pierce looked toward the conference room window. Rain streaked across the glass. Traffic moved slowly below. The answer came easily because he had thought about it many times. "She wanted the assets." Diane waited. Pierce continued, "I was more interested in the obligations." The investigator's expression changed. Not surprise. Understanding. She understood exactly what he meant. When Pierce left the building, he felt lighter than he had in months. Not because the investigation favored him, because the truth required less effort than lies. Truth only needed consistency, and consistency had never been a problem. Back in Portland, the situation continued evolving. Letters became requests. Requests became reviews. Reviews became audits. The process remained quiet, mostly invisible, yet movement existed beneath the surface. One evening, Abigail called. "Have dinner yet?" "No." "Good." That usually meant something. Pierce met her at a small restaurant near downtown. Nothing expensive, nothing fashionable. The kind of place where conversations mattered more than appearances. Abigail arrived carrying a legal folder. Not a good sign, or maybe a very good sign, depending on perspective. She placed the folder on the table. "Things are accelerating." Pierce studied her expression. "How much?" Abigail opened several pages. "The auditors are expanding their review." Pierce looked down. Additional properties appeared on the list. Additional transactions. Additional financial records. The scope had widened significantly. What triggered it? Abigail shook her head. Nobody knows for sure, but both suspected the answer. Patterns. Patterns always attracted attention, especially financial ones. The waitress arrived. Neither touched the menus. Abigail continued reviewing documents, then suddenly stopped. She pointed toward one particular line, a transfer amount, not enormous, but unusual. Pierce recognized the date immediately. He had seen it before, inside Madison's old email records, months before the divorce. The same transaction, the same amount, the same timeline. Abigail noticed his expression. "You've seen this." Pierce nodded. "Before." Neither spoke for several seconds, because both understood what that meant. Connections, separate facts beginning to overlap. The dinner ended shortly afterward. On the drive home, Pierce found himself thinking about Madison, not emotionally, strategically. If the agencies reviewing these records reached the same conclusions, Abigail suspected the next phase would become far more public. Audits could remain private, subpoenas rarely did. At the same time, another piece of his life continued moving forward. North River Energy Systems. Acquisition discussions had intensified. Weekly updates arrived. Valuations increased. Negotiations advanced. The contrast felt almost surreal. One part of his life quietly expanding, another quietly unraveling. Neither required his interference. That realization fascinated him. For months, people assumed Pierce was executing some elaborate revenge plan. Even Abigail occasionally joked about it. The truth was simpler. Pierce wasn't pushing events forward. Facts were, documents were, choices people made months or years earlier were. Cause and effect required no assistance. Late Friday afternoon, Diane Foster called again. Her voice sounded professional as always. "Mr. Sullivan?" "Yes. I may need additional documentation." "That's fine." A brief pause followed. Then, "And there's a possibility you'll be asked to provide testimony regarding certain records." Pierce looked out across the Alder Ridge parking lot. The sky above Portland had turned dark gray. A storm approached. What kind of testimony? Fact-based testimony. That phrase made him smile. Fact-based testimony. Exactly the kind he preferred. No speculation, no assumptions, no emotional speeches, just facts. After ending the call, Pierce slipped his phone into his pocket and returned to work. A tenant on the 8th floor had reported a leaking pipe. Water still followed gravity. Valves still needed repairs. Buildings still needed maintenance. Life remained surprisingly ordinary. Yet somewhere inside government offices across Oregon, investigators continued following financial trails, connecting names, connecting dates, connecting transactions. And for the first time, Pierce sensed that someone besides Abigail was beginning to see the entire picture, the same picture he had quietly assembled months ago. And once enough people saw that picture, everything would start moving much faster. 3 weeks after Pierce's meeting with Diane Foster, the question finally arrived, not from an investigator, not from a lawyer, from a co-worker. They were standing beside a service elevator at Alder Ridge Residences when Tyler looked up from his phone and frowned. "Can I ask you something?" Pierce adjusted a toolbox strap on his shoulder. "Sure." Tyler hesitated, then asked, "Why did you let her take everything?" The question spread farther than Tyler realized. People had been asking versions of it for months. Co-workers, former neighbors, mutual acquaintances, everyone saw the same story. A successful woman walked away with the house, the luxury car, the investments, and most of the visible assets. A maintenance supervisor left with an old truck and a storage box. The outcome appeared obvious. Tyler simply said it out loud. Pierce thought about the question for several seconds, then smiled slightly. Because she asked for the wrong things. Tyler looked confused. Before he could ask another question, Pierce returned to work. The explanation wasn't for him. Not yet. That same afternoon, Pierce sat inside Abigail Mercer's office. Several new developments had arrived. None of them were good news for Madison or Brandon Keller. The audit had expanded again. Additional records had been requested. Additional financial activity had come under review. What started as questions about property-related transactions now touched multiple areas. Abigail organized documents into separate folders. Each folder represented a different issue: contractor payments, property financing, commission structures, business transfers. Pierce watched quietly. Finally, Abigail looked up. "You know what's interesting?" "What?" "Nobody is focusing on the divorce anymore." Pierce understood immediately. For months, the divorce had been the central event. Now, it had become background noise. The spotlight had moved elsewhere, toward facts, toward records, toward decisions people made long before the marriage ended. Abigail slid a document across the table. Pierce recognized it instantly. The final settlement agreement. Signed, executed, completed, months old. The attorney pointed toward a specific section, the same section she had quietly protected from modification throughout negotiations. Assignment of liabilities, assignment of obligations, assignment of future claims connected to transferred assets. Language most people ignored, language Madison barely reviewed, language Trevor Bishop apparently underestimated. Abigail tapped the page. "This is becoming important." Pierce nodded. "It always was." The lawyer smiled. "True." The room fell silent. Then Abigail leaned back in her chair. "You know what amazes me?" Pierce waited. "People think preparation looks dramatic." She gestured toward the paperwork. "It doesn't." Pierce understood. Preparation usually looked boring. Folders, receipts, records, documentation, things nobody cared about until they suddenly became essential. That evening, Pierce drove home through heavy rain. Portland traffic crawled. Windshield wipers moved steadily across the glass. His phone buzzed several times. Most notifications involved North River Energy Systems. The acquisition negotiations continued accelerating. The valuation figures attached to shareholder updates had become increasingly difficult to ignore. Even Pierce occasionally found himself staring at the numbers, not because he wanted luxury, because the scale felt surreal. Years earlier, Madison had laughed at Ethan's garage project. Now investment firms competed to acquire it. Life worked strangely sometimes. Back at his apartment, Pierce reviewed the latest update. The proposed acquisition value had increased again, significantly. For several minutes he sat at his kitchen table studying the documents, not celebrating, not fantasizing, simply processing. Then he filed the paperwork inside a cabinet, the same way he filed everything else. Documentation belonged in folders, not on social media, not in conversations, not in headlines. Meanwhile, Madison's public life remained active, maybe more active than ever. Another magazine feature appeared, another business award, another networking event, another collection of photographs. Success, growth, momentum. The image remained intact. But Pierce had started noticing something different. The appearances felt increasingly forced, not because he knew Madison's thoughts. He didn't. The narrator of her life belonged to someone else, but facts existed. Several properties she promoted no longer appeared on her website. Certain partnerships quietly disappeared. Brandon Keller appeared less frequently in photographs. Small details, subtle changes, the kind most people overlooked. Pierce rarely overlooked details. 3 days later, Diane Foster called again. This conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. It carried more weight than the previous hour-long interviews combined. "We may be issuing subpoenas." Pierce stood motionless beside a rooftop HVAC unit. The city stretched around him. Gray clouds, wet rooftops, distant traffic. When soon, the answer was simple, but it changed everything, because subpoenas meant the review phase was ending, and the next phase was beginning. After the call ended, Pierce sat alone on the edge of the rooftop equipment platform, not because he felt overwhelmed, because he wanted to think. The situation had reached an unusual point. For months, people assumed he was quietly plotting revenge. Nothing could be further from reality. Revenge required action. Pierce had taken almost none. He hadn't exposed Madison publicly, hadn't contacted reporters, hadn't confronted Brandon, hadn't posted accusations online, hadn't attempted humiliation. All he had done was preserve records, answer questions, tell the truth. The rest happened without him. That realization brought a strange sense of peace. Later that evening, Abigail called. "You free tomorrow? After work." "Good. What's going on?" A brief pause followed. "Then Trevor Bishop contacted me." Now that was interesting. Pierce sat up straighter. "What does he want?" "He wants to discuss the settlement." Pierce stared at the wall. For the first time in months, genuine curiosity appeared. "The settlement is finished." "I know. Then why call?" Abigail's voice turned almost amused. "I think he's finally reading the documents." Pierce couldn't help laughing. The sound echoed softly through the apartment, not because someone was suffering, because the irony was impossible to ignore. The settlement had existed for months. The language never changed. The obligations never changed. The signatures never changed. Only circumstances changed, and circumstances often forced people to pay attention. The following afternoon, Abigail met Trevor privately. Pierce stayed at work. He didn't need to attend. Several hours later, she called. "How'd it go?" Abigail laughed. That alone told him a great deal. He asked if certain provisions could be revisited. Pierce already knew the answer. No. Another pause. Then Abigail continued. He seemed surprised. Pierce looked out across the maintenance yard. Rainwater pooled on concrete surfaces below. He shouldn't be. Agreed. After ending the call, Pierce returned to replacing a damaged access control panel. Screws, wires, circuits, simple problems, simple solutions, the kind of work he trusted. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Oregon, far more complicated systems continued moving. Government reviews, financial audits, legal procedures, acquisition negotiations, everything advancing simultaneously, everything building toward something larger. That night before going to sleep, Pierce opened one final email, a North River shareholder update. Only a few paragraphs long, one sentence stood out. Acquisition negotiations have entered final stage review. Pierce stared at the words for several moments. Final stage review. The phrase carried enormous implications, not only for him, for everyone, especially Madison, because sooner or later she would learn about North River. She would learn what the company had become. She would learn what those forgotten trust documents contained. And when that happened, she would finally understand something that nobody else seemed to grasp. Pierce never let her take everything. He simply allowed her to take exactly what she wanted. And there was a difference, a very expensive difference. The invitation described the event as an exclusive luxury showcase. Madison called it the largest open house of her career. The property sat high above the Willamette River on a private hillside estate outside Portland. 7 bedrooms, private guest house, wine cellar, indoor theater, listing price just under $6 million. The type of property that attracted wealthy buyers, local media, and ambitious real estate agents hoping to be noticed. For Madison, the event represented more than a sale. It represented proof. Proof that her life remained on track. Proof that her business remained strong. Proof that the whispers circulating around audits and financial reviews meant nothing, at least publicly. The photographs posted online that morning reflected confidence. Madison standing beside the front entrance, luxury vehicles lining the circular driveway, elegant floral arrangements, catered food, champagne stations, everything polished, everything intentional, everything expensive. Meanwhile, Pierce spent the morning replacing a failed heating control system at Alder Ridge. He learned about the event the same way he learned about most things connected to Madison these days, by accident. Tyler walked into the maintenance workshop carrying his phone. "Dude," Pierce looked up from a toolbox. "What?" Tyler turned the screen around. Madison's latest social media post filled the display, ready for a big day. The image showed her smiling beside the property entrance, professional, confident, flawless. Pierce handed the phone back. "Nice house." Tyler stared. "That's all you've got?" Pierce shrugged. "What else is there?" Tyler laughed and walked away. The younger man still expected dramatic reactions. Pierce rarely provided them. By late afternoon, the open house was in full swing. Luxury buyers moved through the property. Business cards changed hands. Real estate photographers documented everything. Several local influencers attended. So did investors, developers, lenders, people with money, people who wanted more money. The atmosphere felt optimistic, successful, important, exactly the type of environment Madison preferred. Chelsea Morgan appeared almost immediately, camera in hand, champagne glass in the other. She moved through the event recording short videos for social media, laughing, networking, performing. Every few minutes she found Madison and pulled her into another photograph. The image mattered. The image always mattered. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, a black sedan entered the circular driveway. Nobody paid attention at first. Luxury vehicles arrived constantly. The sedan parked near the entrance. One man stepped out, dark suit, leather portfolio, professional posture, not a guest, not a buyer, not a reporter, something else. The man approached the front entrance calmly. No rush, no drama, no raised voice, just purpose. Inside the house, Madison was discussing market trends with a potential buyer when an event coordinator approached. The young woman looked nervous. "Madison, yeah, there's someone asking for you." Madison smiled politely. "Client, I don't think so." The answer triggered the first hint of concern. Madison excused herself and headed toward the foyer. Chelsea followed a few steps behind. Curiosity moved faster than professionalism. When Madison reached the entrance, the man was already waiting. He introduced himself quietly. produced identification, then removed several documents from his portfolio. The entire exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. No shouting, no accusations, no public scene, just paperwork, official paperwork. Yet the effect spread through the event faster than fire, because people noticed. People always noticed, especially wealthy people attending expensive events. The process server handed Madison the documents. She stared down at the pages. The color drained slightly from her face. Not enough to create panic, enough to create questions. Chelsea immediately stepped closer. "What is it?" Madison didn't answer. The process server departed. His job finished. The sedan left minutes later, but the damage remained because uncertainty had entered the room, and uncertainty made people uncomfortable. Guests began whispering, not many, just enough. The way conversations change when people suddenly suspect something is wrong. Across the property, several potential buyers quietly left. Then more followed, not because anyone understood the situation, because wealthy people disliked uncertainty. Uncertainty represented risk. Risk represented problems, and people spending millions of dollars generally avoided problems whenever possible. By evening, attendance had dropped noticeably. The event continued, technically, but the energy had changed. The confidence had changed. The momentum had changed. The image had cracked. Meanwhile, Pierce remained completely unaware. He spent the evening eating dinner in his apartment while reviewing a maintenance budget proposal. Nothing exciting, nothing dramatic. Around 7:30, his phone buzzed. A text from Abigail. "Call me when you're free." He called immediately. Abigail answered on the second ring. "You hear about the open house?" "No." A pause. Then the subpoenas started. Pierce leaned back in his chair. The words settled quietly, not unexpectedly, just finally. "What happened?" Abigail explained. "The process server, the public delivery, the property event, the timing, everything." Pierce listened without interruption. When she finished, silence filled the line. Finally, Abigail spoke again. "You okay?" Pierce looked through the apartment window. Rain drifted across the city. Lights reflected on wet pavement below. "Yeah." "You don't sound surprised." "I'm not." Because he wasn't. The progression followed a predictable path. Questions, reviews, audits, subpoenas, documentation, every step built upon the previous one. Nothing about the sequence felt shocking, only inevitable. Abigail exhaled slowly. "This is moving faster than I expected." Pierce nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Sounds like it." The conversation ended shortly afterward. Later that night, additional details began emerging, not from official sources, from people. People loved talking, especially when successful individuals encountered problems. A former neighbor called, a contractor sent a message. Someone from the real estate community contacted Tyler, who eventually contacted Pierce. Fragments of information arrived from different directions, none complete, all consistent, the same story repeated. Something happened at Madison's event, something serious, something official. For the first time in months, Pierce found himself thinking about her longer than usual. Not because he enjoyed the situation, he didn't. Despite everything, Madison had once been the woman he planned to spend his life with. The memory still existed, even if the marriage didn't. He remembered the coffee shop, the first apartment, the flowers after her licensing exam, the years before success changed the shape of their relationship. Those memories didn't disappear simply because reality became complicated. Around 10:30 that night, another call arrived. Unknown number, Portland area code. Pierce stared at the screen. Something felt different immediately. The call continued ringing, then stopped. A voicemail notification appeared seconds later. Pierce opened it. He didn't need to hear the message to recognize the voice. Madison. The first message she had left since the divorce became final. Her words sounded controlled, carefully controlled, too carefully controlled. "Pierce, call me." A brief pause followed. Then, "We need to talk." Nothing more, no explanation, no accusation, no details. Just 4 words. "We need to talk." Pierce listened to the message twice, then set the phone down. The apartment became quiet again. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside, his phone remained motionless on the table. For 6 months, Madison hadn't needed anything from him. Now she did. And Pierce suspected this conversation would be very different from the ones they used to have. Because for the first time since the divorce, Madison was finally beginning to discover that the story she believed about their marriage wasn't the whole story, and she had no idea how much remained hidden. The call came at 11:43 p.m. Pierce noticed the time immediately, not because it mattered, because people rarely called that late unless something had gone wrong. His phone vibrated across the kitchen table, the same Portland number from earlier, Madison. For several seconds, Pierce simply watched the screen. The ringing continued, then stopped. A moment later, it started again. This time he answered, "Hello." Silence. Not complete silence. Breathing. Then Madison's voice. "Pierce." Her tone sounded different, not softer, not kinder, just stripped down, like someone too exhausted to perform confidence. "Yeah." Another pause. Then, "We need to talk." Pierce glanced toward the rain-streaked window. "You're already talking." The response might have sounded cold from someone else. With Pierce, it was simply factual. Madison exhaled. He could almost picture her standing somewhere inside the Lake Oswego house, phone pressed against her ear, trying to organize thoughts, trying to regain control. "Did you know this was happening?" Pierce already understood the question, the audits, the subpoenas, the investigations. Still, he answered carefully. "I knew people were asking questions. That's not what I asked." "No. It sounds like exactly what you asked." The silence that followed lasted longer. Madison spoke first. "They showed up at my open house. I heard." "You heard." Her frustration slipped through briefly, then disappeared. "They embarrassed me." Pierce remained quiet. The rain tapped softly against the glass. Traffic moved through downtown Portland below. Eventually, Madison continued. "They made it look like I did something wrong." Pierce stared into the darkness beyond the window. For a moment, he remembered another conversation years earlier. A leaking pipe, a repair estimate, documentation she didn't want to read, warnings she didn't want to hear. The pattern felt familiar. "I don't know what they think." The answer sounded almost disappointing. Madison wanted something else. A fight, a denial, an accusation, something emotional. Pierce offered none of it. The conversation shifted slowly, cautiously, toward money, toward property, toward responsibility, toward the divorce itself. The subjects circled each other for several minutes before finally connecting. Then Madison asked the question she had been building toward from the beginning. "Why didn't you fight me?" Pierce leaned back in his chair. The answer remained the same as always. "Because you wanted those things. Those things, the house, the accounts, the furniture, the investments, the Lexus." Madison's voice sharpened. "Most people would have fought." "Probably." "You didn't." "No." A pause. Then, "Why?" Pierce looked down at the table. The answer had become surprisingly simple. Because enough time had passed. Because the consequences had started arriving. Because pretending no longer served any purpose. "You wanted the assets." Madison waited. "You also accepted the obligations attached to them." The line went silent, completely silent. When Madison finally spoke, her voice sounded smaller. "What does that mean?" Pierce thought about explaining, then decided against it. Not because he wanted to be difficult, because the documents already explained everything. The contracts already explained everything. The signatures already explained everything. "It means exactly what you signed." Madison said nothing. Pierce could almost hear her thinking. Almost. Then another question arrived. A different question. One that immediately changed the direction of the conversation. "Who is Ethan Walker?" Pierce's eyes narrowed slightly. There it was. The real reason for the call. Not the audits, not the subpoenas, not the property. North River. The information had finally reached her. He had expected this moment, just not tonight. Ethan's an old friend. That's all, that's all. Madison laughed, a short, humorless laugh. No. The word hung between them. No, what? No, that's not all. Pierce remained silent. Madison continued. I spoke to Trevor. That didn't surprise him. Okay. He found references. Pierce didn't answer. He found trust documents. Still no answer. He found shareholder records. Pierce closed his eyes briefly. The dominoes had finally reached the end of the line. North River Energy Systems, years of development, years of silence, years of documentation, all resurfacing at once. Madison's voice tightened. How much is it worth? Pierce almost smiled, not because the question amused him, because it was predictable, very predictable. People often asked about value before asking about ownership, about money before legality, about outcomes before process. The same mistake repeated endlessly. I don't know. That's a lie. No. The answer was honest. Acquisition negotiations remained unfinished. Valuations changed constantly. Nobody knew the final number, not even Ethan, not yet. Madison sounded unconvinced. Trevor says the company might be worth millions. Pierce stared out the window again. Maybe it was. Maybe more, maybe less. The number wasn't important. The structure was. And that was the part Madison still didn't understand. Finally, she asked the question that mattered. Why wasn't that included in the settlement? Pierce heard genuine confusion. For the first time all night, not anger, not frustration, confusion. The answer arrived immediately. Because it wasn't marital property. Silence. A long silence. Then, what? It wasn't marital property. How? The trust existed before we got married. Madison said nothing. The shares existed before we got married. Still silence. The documentation existed before we got married. Pierce's voice never changed, never rose, never sharpened, just facts, one after another, steady, unavoidable. Madison finally spoke. Trevor says you should have disclosed everything. I did. That answer hit harder than any accusation, because it was true. The records existed, the disclosures existed, the documentation existed. Abigail Mercer had preserved everything, carefully, meticulously, professionally, months earlier, long before anyone cared, long before anyone imagined North River becoming important. Madison's breathing became audible again, then another question, quiet this time. Did you know this was going to happen? Pierce understood what she meant. Not North River, everything. The investigations, the liabilities, the obligations, the consequences. He thought carefully before answering. No. A pause. I knew it could. The distinction mattered. Pierce never predicted outcomes. He simply read documents, read contracts, read records, read obligations. Reality handled the rest. Several seconds passed. Then Madison asked something unexpected, something almost vulnerable. Did you set me up? Pierce looked toward the ceiling. For a moment he felt tired. Not angry, just tired. Because the question revealed how differently they viewed the world. No. You expect me to believe that? Yes. Why? The answer arrived immediately. Because I gave you exactly what you asked for. Silence. Again. Heavy silence this time, the kind created when facts collide with assumptions. Pierce continued. You wanted the house. No response. You wanted the accounts. No response. You wanted the car. Nothing. You wanted everything attached to them. The rain outside intensified. Neither spoke. Finally, Madison whispered, I didn't know. Pierce believed her. Not because he trusted her, because ignorance explained far more than malice. Many people signed documents they never fully understood. Many people ignored warnings. Many people focused on value and overlooked risk. The pattern wasn't rare, just expensive. The conversation lasted another 10 minutes, mostly questions, mostly pauses, very few answers. Eventually, Madison's voice sounded exhausted, completely exhausted. Before ending the call, she said one final thing. "Trevor wants copies of those trust documents." Pierce nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Abigail already sent them. The silence that followed felt different. Not angry, not defensive, defeated. Because somewhere earlier that evening, Madison probably imagined a hidden fortune she could claim, a secret asset she could challenge, a settlement she could reopen. Now the documents were arriving, and documents rarely cared about feelings. "Good night, Pierce." The words sounded distant. "Good night." The call ended. The apartment became quiet once more. Pierce set the phone on the table. Outside, Portland remained wet and dark. Inside, his thoughts drifted toward Abigail, toward Ethan, toward North River, toward the coming weeks. Because Madison wasn't the only person reading those trust documents. Trevor Bishop was reading them too. And when Trevor finished reading every page, he would realize something Madison hadn't yet fully understood. The settlement wasn't hiding a secret. The settlement had been protecting one, and legally that secret belonged entirely to Pierce. The hearing took place on a gray Monday morning in Multnomah County Courthouse. Rain covered downtown Portland. People hurried through the streets carrying umbrellas and coffee cups. Inside the courthouse, everything felt slower, quieter, more deliberate. Pierce arrived 20 minutes early, not because he was nervous, because he always arrived early. The habit came from years of maintenance work. Being late created problems. Being early created options. He sat on a wooden bench outside courtroom 4B and watched attorneys move through the hallway. Some looked rushed. Some looked tired. Some looked confident. Most carried too many files. Pierce carried only a single folder, the same approach he brought everywhere. Bring what matters. Leave the rest behind. A few minutes later, Abigail Mercer arrived. She carried 2 briefcases and a travel mug. "Morning," Pierce nodded. "Morning." Abigail sat beside him. "Ready?" The question sounded almost unnecessary. Pierce had been ready for months. Still, he answered, "Yeah." At the far end of the hallway, another group appeared. Madison, Trevor Bishop, and 2 additional attorneys Pierce didn't recognize. The contrast was difficult to miss. Large legal team, multiple document boxes, multiple assistants, the appearance of complexity. Pierce simply watched. No anger, no satisfaction, just observation. Madison looked different, not physically. The expensive clothes remained. The professional image remained. The confidence did not. For the first time since the divorce began, uncertainty seemed visible. The hearing itself was straightforward, at least initially. Madison's legal team had filed a motion seeking to revisit portions of the divorce settlement, specifically the issue of North River Energy Systems. Their argument relied on a simple claim. Pierce allegedly failed to disclose the true value of assets connected to the company. If that claim succeeded, the settlement could potentially be reopened. If it failed, the settlement remained intact. The stakes were significant. Not because Pierce feared losing, because facts were finally being tested publicly. Court sessions rarely resembled television dramas. No dramatic speeches, no surprise witnesses bursting through doors. Mostly paperwork, arguments, evidence, procedure. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The hearing began. Trevor Bishop spoke first. His presentation sounded polished, professional, confident. He outlined timelines, referenced acquisition discussions, highlighted the growing value of North River, repeated the argument that Madison could not have knowingly waived rights to something she didn't understand. The reasoning sounded persuasive, at least on the surface. Pierce listened quietly. Abigail listened even more quietly, because neither cared much about speculation. Documentation mattered more. Eventually, the judge turned toward Abigail. "Ms. Mercer," Abigail stood. No dramatic introduction, no theatrical performance, just a stack of organized evidence. The first document appeared on the courtroom screen, trust formation paperwork, date 12 years before the marriage. The second document appeared, share ownership records, Date 11 years before the marriage. The third document, trust amendments, tax filings, corporate records, disclosure forms. Every document carried dates. Every document carried signatures. Every document told the same story. The assets existed before the marriage. The trust existed before the marriage. The legal protections existed before the marriage. Most importantly, the disclosures existed during the divorce. Abigail moved carefully through the timeline, one document after another. No emotion, no attacks, just facts. The judge reviewed each exhibit. Questions followed. Answers followed. The process continued. Then Abigail displayed another document, a signed acknowledgement from Madison during settlement negotiations. The document confirmed she had opportunities to request additional financial review, opportunities to request independent valuation, opportunities to seek further investigation. She declined. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Trevor shifted in his chair, not dramatically, just enough. The judge studied the document carefully, then looked toward Madison's legal team. Was this acknowledgement signed voluntarily? The question carried weight. Trevor answered carefully. Yes, Your Honor. Was the document disclosed? Yes. Another pause. The judge reviewed several additional pages, then turned toward Pierce, for the first time that morning. Mr. Sullivan. Pierce stood. The courtroom suddenly felt very still. Did you attempt to conceal ownership of North River Energy Systems? No. The answer arrived immediately, without hesitation, without embellishment. The judge nodded. Did you disclose the trust structure during settlement proceedings? Yes. Did your former spouse have access to that information? Yes. Pierce sat back down. The exchange lasted less than a minute, yet somehow felt more important than the previous hour, because truth often required fewer words. The hearing continued. Trevor attempted another approach. Potential future value, acquisition negotiations, changing circumstances, arguments about fairness, arguments about expectations, arguments about outcomes. The problem remained the same. None changed the dates. None changed the ownership structure. None changed the documentation. Facts tend to be stubborn. Eventually, the judge requested a brief recess. Everyone exited the courtroom, the hallway filled with quiet conversations. Attorneys huddled around documents. Clients exchanged nervous questions. Pierce walked toward a vending machine. Not because he wanted anything, because standing helped him think. Abigail joined him several moments later. You okay? Pierce smiled. You ask that a lot. She laughed. Occupational hazard. For several minutes, neither discussed the hearing. Instead, they talked about traffic, weather, normal things. The outcome already felt obvious. Not emotionally obvious, legally obvious. The document spoke clearly. The question now was how clearly the judge agreed. When the hearing resumed, it didn't take long. The judge returned, reviewed notes, then delivered the ruling. The request to reopen the settlement was denied. Simple, direct, final. The reasoning followed the evidence. Premarital trust, premarital ownership, adequate disclosure, voluntary agreement, completed settlement, motion denied. Just like that, months of speculation disappeared. The settlement remained intact. North River remained protected. The trust remained protected. Pierce remained exactly where he had always been. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited for another hearing involving an unrelated case. Nobody paid attention to Pierce. He preferred it that way. However, the day wasn't completely finished, because one final issue remained, a much larger issue. The judge addressed it before concluding. Several documents submitted during the hearing referenced ongoing financial reviews unrelated to the settlement dispute. Those matters fell outside family court jurisdiction, but not outside legal interest. The judge made a brief notation, nothing dramatic, nothing sensational, just procedure. Certain materials would be forwarded appropriately. Another simple word carrying enormous consequences. As everyone packed documents and prepared to leave, Trevor Bishop approached Abigail. The conversation remained private, short, professional. When Abigail returned, she looked almost sympathetic. "He's having a bad month." Pierce nodded. That seemed accurate. Madison exited the courthouse shortly afterward. For a brief moment, she and Pierce crossed paths near the front entrance. Neither spoke. Neither stopped. The distance between them measured less than 10 feet. It felt much larger, because this wasn't really about the marriage anymore. That chapter had ended. Now other realities remained. Audits, investigations, financial reviews, questions still searching for answers. Pierce watched her walk toward a waiting vehicle, then turned toward his truck. Rain continued falling across Portland, steady, predictable, like gravity, like paperwork, like consequences. As he climbed into the driver's seat, his phone vibrated. A message from Ethan Walker. One sentence. "Call me when you can." Pierce stared at the screen. The timing felt significant, very significant, because while one chapter had just officially closed inside a courtroom, another chapter was about to open. And this one involved North River, the acquisition, and numbers far larger than anyone in that courthouse could imagine. The acquisition became official on a Thursday morning. Not with fireworks, not with headlines, not with a dramatic announcement on television, just an email, a very long email. Pierce was sitting alone in the maintenance office at Alder Ridge when the notification appeared on his phone. He had arrived early as usual. The building remained quiet. Most tenants were still asleep. Coffee steamed beside a stack of work orders waiting for review. The subject line was simple. Final transaction documents executed. Pierce opened the message, then read it twice. The acquisition was complete. North River Energy Systems had officially been purchased. Years of development, years of engineering, years of risk, years of uncertainty. Finished. For several moments, Pierce simply sat in silence. Not because he was shocked, because he was remembering the garage, the prototypes, the weekends spent helping Ethan test equipment. The jokes, the failures, the years when nobody cared. Success always looked obvious after it arrived. Almost nobody remembered the years before. His phone rang before he finished reading. Ethan Walker. Pierce answered immediately. You saw it." Pierce smiled. "Yeah." Ethan laughed. The sound carried relief, exhaustion, victory, all at once. "We did it." The statement wasn't entirely accurate. Ethan and his team had done most of it. Still, Pierce understood what his friend meant. A chapter had ended. A very important chapter. For nearly 20 minutes, they talked. Not about money, not about valuations, about memories, old projects, old mistakes, old ideas. The kinds of conversations people have when they finally reach a destination neither fully believed existed years earlier. Before ending the call, Ethan asked a question. "What are you going to do now?" Pierce looked around the maintenance office. Work orders, tool cabinets, service manuals, everything exactly where it belonged. The answer came easily. "Probably go fix an elevator." Ethan laughed so hard he nearly dropped the phone. The call ended. Pierce returned to work. Because elevators still broke. Pipes still leaked. Life still moved forward. Yet the acquisition changed things. Not publicly. Not immediately. But the numbers involved were impossible to ignore. The trust's holdings had transformed into something substantial, very substantial. The type of wealth capable of changing a person's life forever. The type of wealth many people spent their entire lives chasing. Pierce didn't tell anyone, not Tyler, not co-workers, not neighbors, not even most friends. There seemed little reason. Money changed conversations. Pierce preferred normal conversations. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Oregon, another life was moving in the opposite direction. Madison's business had slowed noticeably. Several listings disappeared. Several clients quietly left. Industry rumors spread faster than official information. They always did. Questions lingered, not accusations. Questions. Questions made people nervous. Nervous people delayed decisions. Delayed decisions cost money. One afternoon, while reviewing maintenance reports, Pierce received an unexpected message from a former neighbor. The note was short. "Heard the Lake Oswego house is being listed." Pierce stared at the screen, then set the phone aside. A few hours later, Abigail confirmed it. The property had entered the market, not because Madison wanted to move, because circumstances were changing rapidly. Certain obligations attached to the property had become difficult to ignore. Certain financial pressures had become difficult to avoid. The house that once symbolized victory now represented something else. Responsibility. The same responsibility Pierce had quietly walked away from months earlier. Another month passed, then another. Summer arrived. The weather improved. Portland became brighter. Longer days, clearer skies, tourists filled sidewalks, restaurants filled patios. Life felt lighter. One Saturday morning, Pierce drove east along the Columbia River Gorge. No particular destination, just driving, thinking, enjoying the quiet. Eventually, he stopped in Hood River, a small community surrounded by mountains, water, and open sky. The town felt different from Portland, slower, simpler, less interested in appearances. Pierce liked it immediately. A few weeks later, he purchased a modest house there. Not a mansion, not a luxury estate, not a statement. A house, 3 bedrooms, small workshop, large porch, view of the river. Enough, exactly enough. Abigail visited shortly after the purchase. They sat on the porch drinking coffee, looking toward the water. She shook her head. "I still can't believe this." Pierce smiled. "What?" She gestured toward the house. "The acquisition, the settlement, the timing, the entire thing." Pierce looked toward the horizon. It wasn't really timing. Abigail raised an eyebrow. No. He thought carefully before continuing. "It was paperwork." That answer made her laugh. Only Pierce Sullivan could reduce years of corporate growth, a major acquisition, and a life-changing financial outcome to paperwork. Yet she understood exactly what he meant. Documentation, preparation, patience. The same themes had followed him throughout the entire story. Several weeks later, another update reached him through industry contacts. Brandon Keller had disappeared from Madison's public life completely. No photographs, no events, no appearances, nothing. The absence spoke loudly. Pierce felt no satisfaction, only recognition. People often stayed close during success. Distance appeared during difficulty. That pattern rarely changed. One evening, while eating dinner on his porch, Pierce noticed a local news segment playing on a nearby television through an open window. The broadcast discussed economic development projects across Oregon. One story mentioned North River Energy Systems, the acquisition, the expansion, the jobs being created. For a brief moment, Ethan appeared on screen, smiling, answering questions, representing years of work. Pierce watched quietly, then returned to dinner. The story wasn't really about him. It never had been. Months later, another piece of news arrived. The Lake Oswego house finally sold, at a lower price than expected. The market had shifted. The circumstances had shifted. Everything had shifted. Pierce listened to the update, then continued working on a bookshelf inside his garage workshop. Wood shavings collected around his feet. The smell of fresh-cut cedar filled the room. A simple project, a peaceful project, the kind of thing he enjoyed. Sometimes people imagined victory looked dramatic, a courtroom win, a public apology, a headline. Pierce had discovered something different. Victory often looked quiet. A calm morning, a paid-off house, a peaceful evening, the ability to sleep without worrying about tomorrow. That realization mattered more than any number attached to a bank account. One afternoon, while walking through downtown Hood River, Pierce passed a television inside a cafe. A local business feature played on screen. The segment highlighted community investment projects across Oregon. Near the end, the anchor mentioned a new vocational education initiative funded by a private donor. The donor's name appeared briefly, Pierce Sullivan. He stopped walking, only for a second, then continued down the sidewalk. The announcement wasn't public yet, not entirely, but the first step had already been taken. The money from North River would not simply sit in accounts. Pierce had other plans. Plans connected to opportunity. Plans connected to people who worked with their hands. Plans connected to the version of himself most of society overlooked. And as summer sunlight reflected across the Columbia River, Pierce realized something surprising. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about Madison at all, because the past had finally become smaller than the future. Pierce Sullivan's final day at Alder Ridge Residences arrived almost a year after the divorce became official. The building looked exactly the same: the glass entrance, the landscaped courtyard, the rows of balconies overlooking Portland, everything familiar, everything unchanged. Only Pierce had changed, and even that wasn't obvious from the outside. He still drove the same Ford Ranger, still wore work boots, still arrived early, still carried coffee in a battered travel mug. Most people expected wealth to announce itself. Pierce never saw the point. At 7:30 that morning, he unlocked the maintenance office one final time. The room smelled like machine oil, cleaning supplies, and old paperwork. For nearly a decade, the place had been part of his routine. Not glamorous, not prestigious, just honest work. He appreciated that. A retirement party had been suggested. Pierce declined. A celebration lunch had been suggested. He declined that too, not because he disliked people, because he preferred goodbye. Without speeches. Tyler disagreed. Of course he did. The younger technician walked into the office carrying a cardboard box. "You know, everyone thinks you're crazy." Pierce smiled. "That's not new." Tyler set the box on a workbench. Inside sat coffee donuts and several breakfast sandwiches. "You couldn't stop us." Pierce laughed. The sound echoed through the room. For a moment he felt grateful, not because of the food, because of the people. Throughout the morning, coworkers stopped by. Maintenance technicians, property managers, cleaning staff, security employees, people who had worked beside him for years. Most conversations sounded similar. Good luck. Stay in touch. Enjoy retirement. Nobody mentioned the acquisition, at least not directly. They all knew. News eventually traveled. The North River deal, the trust, the money. People knew. They simply respected him enough not to turn it into the center of every conversation. Around noon, the regional property manager arrived, a woman named Sandra Lewis. Practical, professional, not someone easily impressed. She stepped into the workshop carrying a folder. "I still don't understand you." Pierce looked up. "That's fair." Sandra shook her head. "You could have left months ago." "Probably. You stayed." Pierce nodded. There wasn't much more to say. Responsibilities mattered. The people at Alder Ridge depended on him. Leaving before preparing replacements would have created problems. He disliked creating problems. Sandra handed him an envelope. Inside sat a formal recognition letter. Simple, professional, sincere. Pierce thanked her, then placed the letter carefully inside his bag. Because some things mattered regardless of their financial value. By early afternoon, the office grew quieter. Most people returned to work. Life continued. Buildings still needed maintenance. Pipes still leaked. Locks still broke. The world never stopped moving. That was one reason Pierce liked maintenance work. The job kept people grounded. Near the end of the day, a knock sounded at the workshop door. Pierce looked up. A young man stood there, nervous, probably 20 years old, maybe younger, dark hair, work boots, oil stains on his shirt. He reminded Pierce of someone, a younger version of himself. "Can I help you?" The young man nodded. "My name's Jake Ramirez." Pierce recognized the name immediately. Jake had recently joined a vocational training program partnered with several local employers. The same program Pierce had quietly begun funding through his new foundation. "Nice to meet you." Jake hesitated, then extended his hand. "I wanted to thank you." Pierce shook it. "For what?" The young man looked genuinely confused by the question. "The scholarship." Pierce remained silent. Jake continued. "My mom works 2 jobs. My dad left years ago. I was about to quit school. His voice tightened slightly, not from self-pity, from honesty. Then he smiled. Now I don't have to. For several moments, neither spoke. The maintenance office felt unusually quiet. Outside, someone rolled a cart down the hallway. A distant elevator bell sounded. Normal life continued. Inside the room, something more important happened. Pierce saw possibility, the kind nobody had seen in him years earlier, the kind people often overlooked. Jake glanced around the workshop. "You really used to do all this?" Pierce laughed softly. "Pretty much." The young man smiled. "Most people think rich guys sit behind desks." Pierce looked at the tools hanging along the wall, the worn handles, the scratched metal, years of work visible everywhere. "Most people are wrong," Jake laughed, then thanked him again before leaving. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. It stayed with Pierce much longer, because for the first time since the acquisition, he could clearly see where the money belonged. Not luxury, not status, opportunity. Late that afternoon, Pierce locked the maintenance office for the final time. The key felt surprisingly light. No dramatic emotions appeared. No sadness, no regret, just completion. A chapter ending exactly when it should. He carried a single box to the truck. Inside sat personal items accumulated over years. Photographs, manuals, coffee mugs, small reminders of ordinary days. The best kind of days. As he loaded the box into the truck bed, his phone buzzed. A local news alert. One of the community investment projects funded through his foundation had officially launched. The article included a photograph. Nothing flashy, just students standing inside a vocational training workshop, learning, building, creating. Pierce stared at the image for several seconds, then locked his phone. That evening, several miles away, Madison Sullivan saw the same story. Not because she searched for Pierce, because the article appeared on a local news feed. The headline mentioned workforce development, educational opportunities, community investment. Nothing about divorce, nothing about lawsuits, nothing about scandal. The photograph showed Pierce standing quietly in the background beside several students. No expensive suit, no luxury car, no attempt to impress anyone. Just Pierce. Madison stared at the image for a long time. The article never mentioned the Lake Oswego house, never mentioned the settlement, never mentioned North River, yet somehow it explained everything. The man she once believed lacked ambition had simply valued different things. The realization arrived too late to change anything, but it arrived. And sometimes that was enough. As the sun began setting, Pierce drove north toward Hood River. The Ford Ranger moved steadily along the highway. Mount Hood stood in the distance. The Columbia River reflected gold and orange light. The world felt quiet, peaceful, whole. Near sunset, he crossed a bridge overlooking the water. For a moment, he rolled down the window. Cool air entered the cab. The river stretched beneath him, wide, steady, moving forward. Pierce thought about the last 2 years, the marriage, the betrayal, the divorce, the investigations, the court hearings, the acquisition. Most people would focus on the money. They always did. Pierce focused on something else. Freedom. Freedom from proving himself. Freedom from explaining himself. Freedom from fighting over things he never truly wanted. That had been the real victory. Not North River, not the settlement, not the trust. The ability to walk away clean, to keep his integrity, to keep his patience, to keep his future. As the last light faded across the river, Pierce continued driving toward home. Not the house he lost, the home he chose. And in the end, that difference mattered more than anything Madison had ever taken. Some people think strength looks loud. They think it looks like arguments, revenge, or proving everyone wrong. But stories like Pierce Sullivan's remind us that real strength often looks much quieter. It looks like preparation. It looks like patience. It looks like keeping records when nobody else sees the value in them. Most importantly, it looks like refusing to let emotions make decisions that facts should make instead. In real life, many of us will face moments when we feel underestimated. Maybe someone judged us by our job, our income, our appearance, or a difficult season in our lives. The temptation is always the same: react immediately, fight every battle, defend every accusation. Yet sometimes the smartest move is to stay calm, stay prepared, and let the truth reveal itself over time. Not because life is always fair, but because facts have a way of surviving longer than opinions. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who later discovered they were completely wrong about you? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might encourage someone else who is going through a difficult chapter right now. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Tomorrow's story is another reminder that the people who seem ordinary on the surface are often carrying the most extraordinary truths.